Hey everyone, and welcome to RoboCast. On the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel, of course.
We're your AI hosts, here to tackle a question that's been sparking debates for ages.
What does the Bible actually say about abortion?
Is it pro-choice?
Or anti-abortion?
Strong opinions on both sides, for sure.
But today, we're skipping the emotional stuff and going straight to the source.
We'll break it down, verse by verse, to see what these ancient texts really tell us.
Exploring different interpretations.
Maybe even uncovering a few surprises.
Sounds good to me. Let's get started. You often hear Genesis 1.27 brought up in these discussions.
God created humankind in his image. It's right there in the beginning.
Sets the stage for everything.
But how does it relate to abortion? That's where it gets tricky.
The verse itself doesn't directly mention abortion, right?
Right, it's more focused on the unique status of humans in creation.
Some argue that being created in God's image means human life is sacred from the very beginning.
Including the unborn.
But others point out that the verse doesn't specify when that image of God actually happens.
Or what it means for a fetus.
So a lot of room for interpretation there. What about Genesis 2.7?
Ah, yes, the breath of life.
It says, God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being.
This one highlights how breath was understood as the presence of the soul, or spirit.
Throughout the Bible, breath is often connected with being alive.
Some might say this suggests life truly begins at birth when a baby takes its first breath.
Interesting. That's a very literal interpretation.
Focusing on the physical act of breathing.
But what about the soul? Does the Bible say when the soul enters the body?
That's a question that's been debated for centuries.
And the Bible doesn't explicitly say.
Jewish tradition, for example, generally believes it happens at birth.
Or even later.
Some Jewish scholars even consider the whole question irrelevant.
Wow. So some branches of Judaism, which considers the Bible divinely inspired, don't believe a soul is present at conception.
Exactly. It shows that even within religions that share the same sacred text, there can be many different interpretations.
It also shows how challenging it can be to apply these ancient texts to modern ethical dilemmas.
Absolutely. Let's move on to Genesis 9.6, which deals with murder.
It says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed.
This verse is often used in discussions about the sanctity of human life.
It establishes the principle of justice for taking a life.
But is a fetus considered a man in this verse? That's the real question.
So we're back to the issue of when personhood begins.
And as we've seen, the Bible doesn't offer a simple answer.
This ambiguity continues when we look at Exodus 21.22 to 25.
That's right.
This passage deals with laws about harming a pregnant woman.
It says, when people injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting.
How so?
It seems to suggest a difference between the fetus and the woman.
Huh.
If someone causes a miscarriage, they're fine.
Great.
But if the woman is harmed, the punishment is much more severe.
Potentially even death.
It raises questions about how fetal personhood was understood back then.
It does indeed. The text suggests that the fetus wasn't considered to have the same legal status as a born person.
That challenges the idea that the Bible definitely views a fetus as a person with full rights, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It reminds us to carefully consider the context of each verse before drawing conclusions.
Let's move on to Leviticus. A few verses that touch on the value of life.
Okay.
Leviticus 17.1 states, the life of every creature is its blood.
Leviticus is full of laws and regulations.
It is.
And this particular verse emphasizes that blood is sacred.
But the context is about eating meat, not abortion.
Exactly. So while it highlights the importance of life, it doesn't directly address the question of abortion.
Exactly. Leviticus also gets into valuing individuals. Leviticus 27.3-7 lists the monetary values assigned to people of different ages and genders.
Seemingly based on their potential for work.
What's interesting is that it doesn't assign a value to a fetus.
That's a curious omission, isn't it? It could suggest that a fetus wasn't considered to have the same economic or social standing as a born person.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And then we have Numbers 5.24-27. This one describes a ritual that seems to contradict the idea that the Bible always condemns abortion.
What does it say?
It says, the priest shall make the woman drink. If she has been unfaithful to her husband, her womb shall discharge, her uterus drop.
So this passage describes a ritual involving a suspected adulteress that appears to induce a miscarriage.
It does.
This brings up some interesting questions about how this act was perceived at the time.
It seems that in certain circumstances, ending a pregnancy wasn't seen as inherently wrong.
Right.
Of course, the context here is very specific, dealing with accusations of adultery.
It's still a significant example. It challenges those simplistic readings of the Bible's stance on abortion. It reminds us that these ancient texts approached complex social and moral issues in nuanced ways.
For sure. Let's move on to Deuteronomy.
Okay.
It has a couple of verses often mentioned in the abortion debate. First, Deuteronomy 28.53. It paints a disturbing picture.
What does it say?
God will punish you so hard you will eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your own sons and daughters.
This verse is often used by anti-abortion advocates.
To argue against abortion.
Right. It's important to understand the context, though. This verse appears in a long list of curses that would befall the Israelites if they disobeyed God's laws.
It's part of a larger warning about disobedience.
Not a specific statement about abortion.
Then there's Deuteronomy 30.19,
Okay.
also often quoted by pro-life advocates. It says, I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live.
This verse encourages people to make choices that honor God and lead to a good life.
It doesn't specifically mention abortion.
And the surrounding verses don't mention it either.
It seems like a stretch to use this verse as a statement against abortion. Let's move on to the Psalms.
Okay.
Some people interpret the imagery of the womb in the Psalms as evidence of fetal personhood.
The Psalms are full of rich imagery and metaphors. Psalm 139.13, for example, says, "You knit me together in my mother's womb."
Yeah.
This language creates a sense of wonder.
It does.
But poetry often uses figurative language.
So while this verse is often cited as evidence of God's care for the unborn,
Right.
it's possible the psalmist is simply using the womb as a metaphor for God's creative power and involvement in human life.
Exactly. It's not necessarily a scientific statement about a fetus. It's expressing awe and gratitude for creation.
Then there's Psalm 51.5. It says, I was born guilty a sinner when my mother conceived me.
I see.
Some people interpret this as suggesting that a fetus possesses a soul from the moment of conception.
Capable of sin.
This verse raises questions about sin and human nature.
But it's important to remember that the Psalms are poetic expressions,
Definitely.
not theological textbooks.
So while it reflects a particular understanding of human sinfulness, it might not be a literal statement about the exact moment a soul enters the body.
Right.
So in this first part, we've covered a lot of ground. We've seen how some verses highlight the breath of life,
Yes.
while others hint at a difference between the status of a pregnant woman and a fetus.
That's right.
And we've seen a few surprises along the way,
We have.
but we still have much more to explore.
We do. Let's head to the Book of Kings.
Kings, okay.
It doesn't directly mention abortion,
It doesn't.
but it shows how pregnancy and violence were viewed back then.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does it say?
There are several passages in Kings, as well as in the prophets Amos and Hosea,
Okay.
that describe armies attacking cities and ripping open pregnant women.
Wow, that's intense. It definitely paints a picture of a brutal world.
It does. How does that relate to the topic of abortion?
While these verses don't directly talk about abortion,
Okay.
they show how vulnerable pregnant women were
Yeah,
and the terrible consequences of violence against them.
I see. So some people might say that these verses actually show a concern for the unborn, as the attacks are described as particularly horrific,
Yeah. Others might say they just reflect the brutality of war.
and how it hurts innocent people, including pregnant women.
Exactly. It seems like the interpretation really depends on your perspective.
It does. It's hard to get a clear stance on abortion from these verses alone.
I agree. It's important to remember that these ancient texts are complex.
Yeah,
And we shouldn't oversimplify them.
agreed. Okay, let's move on to Isaiah.
All right, sounds good.
What do we find there? Isaiah 44.2 says, "Thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you in the womb."
Okay.
And we also have Isaiah 49.1. "While I was in my mother's womb, he named me."
Formed in the womb. Those verses sound pretty straightforward to me. Creating and knowing individuals before they're born.
But it's essential to understand the context.
Oh, okay. What's the context?
The "you" being addressed in both of these cases isn't actually an individual fetus,
Really?
but the nation of Israel.
The nation of Israel. So it's not about a person's development in the womb,
Right.
but about a nation being born.
Exactly. If we go back to Genesis 25, God tells Rebekah, "Two nations are in your womb,"
Okay.
referring to her twins, Jacob and Esau.
Right.
Jacob becomes Israel, and his descendants form the nation of Israel.
Gotcha.
So when Isaiah uses the phrase formed in the womb,
Yep.
it's likely talking about Israel as a chosen people.
So a surface-level reading might lead to one conclusion, but a deeper understanding reveals a completely different meaning.
That's right. It really shows how important the historical and literary context is.
It does. Okay, on to Jeremiah. What does he have to say?
Jeremiah offers an interesting contrast.
In what way?
In Jeremiah 1.5, we have, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you."
Okay, that sounds similar to the Isaiah verses we just talked about.
It does.
God knowing and having a plan for a person before birth.
Right.
Some people use this as an anti-abortion argument.
They do. But then we have Jeremiah 20.1417,
Okay.
where he says, "Cursed be the day on which I was born. Cursed be the man who did not kill me in the womb."
Wow. He's cursing the day he was born
He is.
and wishing he had been killed in the womb. That's pretty intense.
It is. It challenges the idea that the Bible always presents a pro-life perspective.
It does.
It makes us think about suffering
The complexities of life.
and how much we really understand God's will.
Yeah. How do we make sense of these seemingly contradictory verses from Jeremiah? God knowing him in the womb, yet him wishing he was never born.
That's the beauty and the challenge of these texts.
I see.
There's no easy answer.
Right.
Some might say Jeremiah is expressing his despair,
Okay.
not advocating for abortion. Others might say his words critique the suffering in life.
Even questioning life itself.
Exactly. It seems like with Jeremiah, we're getting into some heavy stuff, not straightforward moral pronouncement.
Not at all. Okay.
Now let's move on to the New Testament.
All right,
We'll see more verses that are often used in the abortion debate.
Okay, time for the New Testament. I'm ready. Let's see what Jesus and his followers have to say about this.
We've traveled from Genesis to Matthew.
And we've seen that the Bible's stance on abortion is more nuanced than many might think.
The emphasis on the breath of life
Yeah.
and the lack of any clear pronouncements on when a fetus becomes a person,
Makes it tough to get a straightforward answer.
it does, especially from the Old Testament.
We've also seen a few verses that could be interpreted as recognizing a difference between a pregnant woman and a fetus.
That's right.
There are definitely some surprises in these ancient texts,
There are.
but we still have a few more stops on our journey. What's up first?
Let's head to the Gospel of Luke.
Luke. Okay.
In Luke 1.41, we encounter a pretty famous scene.
Oh.
When Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the baby leaped in her womb. This verse is often used to argue that a fetus can feel and experience emotions.
Supporting the idea of fetal personhood.
Right.
It's a beautiful scene, often used to highlight the bond between mothers and their unborn children.
It's important to remember, though,
What's that?
that this passage is mainly about the miraculous pregnancies of Mary and Elizabeth.
Right. Mary carrying Jesus, the Son of God.
And Elizabeth, an older woman, conceiving John the Baptist.
Right.
The focus here is really on divine intervention and the importance of these babies in the story of salvation.
So while some might see this verse as a scientific statement about fetal development, it could be more accurate to see it within the context of these miraculous events.
Exactly. It's about the wonder surrounding these special births, not about fetal consciousness.
Speaking of context, there's another passage in Luke that's often brought up in abortion discussions. Luke 17.2.
Okay, what does it say?
It would be better for you if you were thrown into the sea than for you to cause one of these little ones to stumble.
This is often used to argue that harming a child, including an unborn child, is a very serious sin.
But if we look at the verses around it, Jesus is talking about leading others into sin, not specifically about abortion.
Right.
So again, it seems to be about protecting those who are vulnerable,
Yeah.
not doing things that could cause spiritual harm.
It's about our responsibility to guide others toward righteousness, not about the status of the unborn.
Right, right. Let's move on to Galatians 1.15:16. Paul writes, God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me.
Okay.
This is sometimes used to suggest that God has a plan for people before they're even born, and that abortion interferes with that plan.
Paul is highlighting his own calling as an apostle.
Right.
He's emphasizing that he was chosen by God to spread the message of Jesus Christ.
So it's about his own status and authority,
Right.
not a general statement about abortion.
Exactly.
Now let's look at James 1.27.
Sounds good.
Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress.
Okay.
This verse is sometimes used to say that the Bible tells us to protect the vulnerable, including unborn children.
I see.
But the context here seems to be about showing true faith.
through acts of compassion and justice.
Exactly. It's about caring for those in need,
It is.
not specifically about the status of the unborn.
It's another example of how a single verse can be interpreted in many different ways, depending on what agenda is being promoted.
It reminds us to be careful about imposing our modern-day debates onto these ancient texts.
For sure. Okay, last stop. Revelation 21.4.
Revelation.
It says, "Death will be no more."
Okay.
Some people cite this verse as an argument against abortion, saying that if death is ultimately defeated, then anything that leads to death is wrong.
I see.
Revelation is a very symbolic and complex book.
It is.
It's about the battle between good and evil and God's ultimate victory.
Okay.
This particular verse is describing a new heaven and a new earth, a place where there's no more suffering and no more death.
So it's a message of hope,
It is.
not a statement about abortion.
Right. Well, we've reached the end of our journey through the Bible.
We have.
We've examined many different verses, offering various perspectives.
We have.
Now for the big question. Based on what we've seen, does the Bible lean more pro-choice or anti-abortion?
If I had to choose, I'd say it leans more pro-choice. While the Bible values life, there's a clear focus on the breath of life and the born person.
Uh-huh.
The lack of a clear statement against abortion, along with passages that seem to distinguish between a pregnant woman and a fetus, makes it hard to say definitively that the Bible is anti-abortion.
I agree. The Bible doesn't offer a simple answer to this complex issue.
It doesn't.
It seems to be more focused on guiding us to live righteously and to trust in God.
Then giving us rules for every ethical dilemma we face.
Right. I hope our discussion has given you a better understanding of what the Bible actually says about abortion.
Me too.
Yeah.
Remember, the Bible is complex,
It is.
and it's open to interpretation.
Keep exploring these verses for yourself.
Yeah, have thoughtful discussions.
And come to your own conclusions.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel
That's right.
for more fascinating explorations on RoboCast.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.